smoothly. I hear nothing actually from the stream. Oh, I hear me actually, but I don't hear you.
Okay. What about now? Do you hear anything now?
Perfect. I can hear
Okay.
you now.
Alrighty. Sweet, sweet. Okay. Alrighty. Glad we issued. Glad we got those out of the way. Alrighty. So welcome to the Anime Podcast. 2021 Spring Gauntlet. This is week 5. Um, yeah.
Yeah, happy to be here again. My name is Manatsu. Co-hosting with me here is John. How was your week, dude?
It was pretty good. I am getting, I have some real life stuff going on, so there was a slight amount of cram, and I think that there was also, from what I've heard, some cram on your parts as well too. So I got to watch a lot of the animes in relatively closer, I guess, adjacency to each other, and so that definitely, I actually personally thought it was nice, and like if it wasn't for the kind of fatigue that came along with it, it's almost easier to be able to immediately compare, like, show to show when like everything's super fresh in your mind. So, anyways, I mean, definitely some goods and some bads. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into it and see what we are going to have this week.
Yeah, so we're just gonna start off with again the top eight. We are making a little change. Instead of featuring the bottom eight as the drop list, we're changing it to bottom six, just because we have a smaller amount of shows, so it makes more sense that our drop list is a little bit smaller. But our top eight will remain the same.
Alrighty.
And so, yeah, we'll kick us off with number one here.
Number one is a new. The rolling average went up by .01.
Yeah, yeah.
Vivi's Flora Eye song is now our number one pick. Minatsu gave it a 7.3, and I gave it a score of 8. And yeah, the
And
rolling
eight
average
was your
is
highest
now.
score this week.
Yeah, and it was my highest score this week, giving it a score of 7.61. Yeah, I thought this was. I mean, this show continues to really knock it out of the park. I think that
Mm-hmm.
it does a very. It's let me put it like this: for a show that has this much time, not necessarily skipping, but there is. I mean, okay, it's kind of skipping. It's not.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not. It's not like necessarily a big bunch of back and then forward, but it is like, okay, here's one scene, and then here's 5 years, and then here's 20 years or whatever. Right? There's like
yeah.
there's jumps in between, and so for a show that actually covers this amount of time, and it still ends up developing and kind of delivering like nice, I guess, punches both in terms of just like plot points and also in terms of like character development. I think it's just it's really great.
Yeah.
I think this week in particular, though, one of the scenes that like it's that really caught my eye was when essentially she was asking some of the what she called kind of the more, I guess, the more simpler M robots, right? The ones that
Mm-hmm.
were in the autonomy, and then she was asking him like, oh, like, when you are trying to do your mission, like, like, or when you are
Yeah,
doing
that
an
fulfillment.
objective, like, yeah, it's like, what does fulfillment look like? What is a heart, right? And like, it's such a I think it's a very interesting way of kind of like approaching, shall we call, like, human emotions, right? In a show that's a lot
Mm-hmm.
that has a lot
Yeah.
of focus about androids, right? And I think that, like, like moments like that where it's just like, damn, you're like, as a human, right? It's like, as a human watching this, it's still like, it still feels incredibly relatable, even though, it's plain as day. It's about, AIs fulfilling like a fulfilled objective. But yeah, I just think like the show's format and just kind of like the plot points and the character developments, like, slash, like, I guess, like, if you want to call it that, like, human condition commentary, ends up being just continuously like so top notch. And yeah, I mean, this is just
Yeah,
amazing. And
and I mean the
yeah,
animation's just so smooth and so crisp, that it engages you a lot. And then yeah, and I think in terms of the human, like the flavor of the human engagement
yeah,
there, right? Vivi only has like one mission, right? And
yeah,
supposed to, and it's so difficult, and she's trying to figure out what her purpose is,
Yeah.
and all these time gaps.
Hmm.
I'm starting to get more interested in Matsumoto as a
Yeah.
character.
Hmm.
His origin story and like how he comes back.
Yeah.
It's one of the few shows that I really just want to watch ahead
Yeah.
of the
Oh yeah.
program.
No, like there are only a very small handful, and at least from I don't know this week's rankings, since they're a surprise to me, but at least from all the previous weeks, like the ones that end up in like like the top four ish, like usually are just incredibly like I'm just like oh I really want to click next and just continue to watch it just because like it delivers like a great story and you're like damn I want to watch more.
Hmm.
Yeah, this
Exactly.
show, I am honestly not very surprised that this show really, I guess now is, I took the number one spot. I think that it definitely has, I will say that out of the top three shows, I would say this one has the most consistency in quality, I'd say.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, by
like,
far.
yeah, I would say this one has a, like may not necessarily have some of those like super tear jerking moments, but like the quality is just always up there. Like I've never left an episode being like, oh, I kind of like wish that it was as good as like X episode. Like obviously there's gonna be
Hmm.
slight fluctuations, but it's always like incredible quality. Like just
Yeah, and I mean, leading up to this week's
mm,
episode, we both kind of knew that this was gonna overtake
yeah.
those Snow White notes. It just
Hmm.
was a matter of like how long, because uh, it wasn't as strong as those Snow White notes in the first few weeks.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's consistent, and
Yeah.
you can clearly see with the rolling average, the fact that it only went up by only 0.01,
Yeah.
and it already has a high rolling average. It kind of
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Alrighty, yeah. And on the topic of other still amazing shows, at number two we have those Snow White notes. Rolling in at number two, Manasa gave a score of 5.7. I gave a score of 7 to bring the rolling average to 7.41.
Yeah, so I scored this rather low this time
Okay.
around.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of it is because I'm a little tired of all the exposition about sound. I think
Okay.
there is a lot of expository
Mm-hmm.
about the differences and nuances of sound, which I think is interesting
Yeah.
when you scatter it here and there. But I think
Mm-hmm.
when you mention it every 4 minutes, it becomes a little dry. Like
Yeah.
I want you to show me this, not don't explain and explain. And like as a viewer, I'm like, I guess I'll have to believe it, even though you're not really showing me these
Mm.
differences.
I think that like okay, full disclosure, I was trained on, like a Western scale, right? This is like an Eastern scale, and so the music systems and kind of like the music theory behind, like a shamisen music versus Western music isn't exactly the same. So I can't claim I'm like a complete authority in that. I will say that like when it comes to like the mechanical, I guess like the mechanical explanations, my perspective on that one is actually like I think there's still a decent amount of show, but this is the lowest score I gave for this show out of all the episodes, and the reason why is because this is the first time where you hit me with a crazy amount of, I guess, like mechanical thing, and you didn't back it up with a lot of emotion. I guess this is like for
Hmm.
me where it's like,
Yeah,
oh, it
yeah.
becomes a lot more noticeable, right? It's like I think like in all the previous episodes, like if you're gonna like really focus down on, I guess, kind of like the mechanics, right? Like let's to talk about mechanics, it's like oh like burning Kabaddi, right? It's like if you're gonna just
Hmm.
overload me with a big bunch of mechanics, what this show traditionally has done in the past, which I think all pushed it like like a significant tier above burning Kabaddi, was that like oh there was like some like nice emotional moment that gets kind of built out and just like delivered as a punch. And I kind of get that, like, I guess more or less like a slice of life show can't continuously deliver these type of things, but like this is the
Hmm.
first episode where I just felt like oh it's like it's glaringly, it's almost like what the mechanics that you were talking about become much more glaringly obvious because you don't have that like extra like shall I say like a peak emotional moment that like
Hmm.
occurs like in the episode. And so yeah, this is like it got the lowest rating of it. I'm still hopeful that like overall like maybe like 2/3 of the episode will still have some nice emotional moment where it's like oh damn, like that's like a feels like either good, feels like sad or whatever, right? But like this is one where I like it definitely, like I like realized like kind of like after thinking about the episode and looking back at it, I was like oh this is the first time I didn't really have it. And I guess like I said, like it's still like a decent show, and like like I don't expect a slice of life to continuously just like deliver punches every episode, but this was definitely like, I think it's just like, to talk about the topic of like mechanical things. Like I think this one was a lot more noticeable in my mind because we didn't have kind of like a ooh, like damn, like I like that like type of moment, and it's just like
Yeah,
yeah.
and I'm a little worried if this is just what's gonna happen, that they're just gonna talk about the sound and have less, like, what this episode was missing was character
Hmm.
development. There wasn't
Yeah.
much of it
Hmm.
at all. It was mostly like, oh, reactions to how these two really amazing players play the
Hmm.
shamisen together.
Hmm.
But all the minor characters are boring.
Yeah.
Like, I
Hmm.
think the main character is, I mean, obviously the main character, so
Yeah.
he's interesting, but
Hmm.
everyone else kind of fell flat, right? Now that
Hmm.
I forgot the girl's name, but the girl's grandma has heard the song.
Yeah.
Her like arc is kind of over, so it's like very not interesting anymore. So I
Hmm.
need the show to give me more interest in either the side characters or
Hmm.
something else has to be evolving, not just the knowledge of the sound.
Yeah. Alrighty.
All right, move
Yeah,
on
and
to
then at
number
number
three.
3 is 86.
Yeah,
It came in at number 3. Manatsu gave it a score of 6.8. I gave it a score of 8, which keeps the rolling average actually exactly the same at 7.11.
yeah. So another consistent show. The show you gave it the high score that you gave to any show, which was 8. I mean, this episode was really interesting to me because I think in the earlier half it was a little bit, nothing much happening. If
Yeah.
anything, I just kind of asked myself, like, what, like, wait, why did this war start again? Because I don't even
Yeah.
remember why this
Hmm.
war started.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine that I don't need to know the reason why,
Hmm.
because then it could be more of a statement about, oh,
Hmm.
it doesn't matter what started the war. These kids are just living in and I have to kind of live through it. I'm like, if that's a commentary, I'm like, okay, cool. That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
And so the earlier half was kind of slow. I don't
Okay.
know if you felt the same.
Yeah.
The back half was really good.
Hmm.
This whole introduction of shepherds
Yeah.
and black sheep. What did you think
Hmm.
of that?
I personally, so I the reason I ended up getting my highest score of the week was because number one, I do think that now providing the context, at least now it kind of stands out from, shall we say, prototypical run of the mill YA dystopia,
Mm-hmm.
la la la, like premise. Because that's genuinely how I felt about the story. I think the story managed to deliver some strong emotional points, like
Yeah.
within the premise, but like it's like you describe her. It's like I don't even really know that much about
Yeah. Yeah.
what is happening in terms of like their dystopia, and almost like I said, like I just take this lens of like, it's another YA dystopia thing, like whatever, and
Sure.
like that's just kind of how I saw it. This is, I think that providing a little bit more mechanics to the backstory is nice. And the second reason why I ended up getting my high score is because I was kind of surprised, I guess, that they were gutsy enough to make it number one. I think like they definitely threw it into the borderline like horror slash like supernatural implication parts, or like they kind of like enter that territory. I was kind of surprised that like
Mm-hmm.
they were like willing to go into that territory, right? Because there's a whole conversation essentially of like, oh, like what exactly are ghosts, right? When
Yeah. Yeah.
Undertaker says like, oh, like he personally believes it's because they went to the other side, and then that's why I hear it. But then there's also like but then they also dive into the mechanical explanation of what black sheep are and the shepherd and all that type
Yeah.
of stuff. And so like it introduces like a decent point. I think, like I said, like I feel like one thing that I miss, or I guess like is kind of missing from some of this YA dystopic future trope, is that like like it's the premises end up all being really relatively a little bit more straightforward, and like essentially the main final point is just like, oh, like people have value as human beings, guys, like individuality is important, and that's just kind of what it is, right? This is the first one where like
Mm-hmm.
I like feel like it's like, oh, like they've actually kind of like introduced like a very interesting twist to it, where I'm just like, oh, hey, I personally I kind of like it. I think that, yeah, like it's a double
Yeah.
whammy of like, oh, like here's we've told you, right? We've told you now a little bit more context, and it definitely makes it more interesting, right? It's like now understanding almost, shall I say, like the the feudal outcome, right? This isn't some sort of like, oh, like
Yes.
there's gonna be like this crazy ending where like PETA and like like Katniss save everyone and just blah blah, yay, everyone's happy in the end. Like that's not gonna happen. Like at least that's not what the show's trying to sell it out to be, right? And
Yeah.
like there is definitely like a sense of like, oh, like we're just fighting this completely like endless war, and like the essentially the all the white, what do they call them, I know it translates from whatever language to like white, like the whitey people, right? The people with like
Alba.
albas, yeah, the albas, like they're just like woefully ignorant of what the
Their
situation is
impending
actually
doom.
like and of the impending doom, right? And so it's like this scenario. It definitely sets up like a very interesting storytelling, kind of like here you go, and like
Well, yeah,
yeah,
I think it's not new to not
okay,
really new because really it just becomes more of an apocalyptic genre,
yeah,
right? Uh, it is cool and interesting to know that the human brain is used by the
yeah,
Legion to right. I think that's fascinating, and how they brought back the gunslinger character,
yeah,
and that's how you figure out that's what mentally broke at
yeah,
least all the other I
yeah,
forget what they're called handlers, all the
yeah,
other
yeah,
handlers, because I thought it was like at the beginning of the show, I was like, oh, the Undertaker seems to be the one responsible
yeah,
for all the handlers like
yeah,
quitting their
yeah,
posts, but in reality, it's not even them. It's the black sheep.
yeah,
So I like that,
yeah.
and I don't know if you are also predicting this, right? Because
Okay.
the Undertaker is saying how he is currently hunting. Uh, he's currently hunting a shepherd,
Yeah. That's gonna be
and
his brother.
we're
It's gonna be
both
yeah,
we're
yeah, yeah,
both
yeah. Like
assuming here
we
it
know,
is his
yeah.
brother.
It's gonna be his brother, and I do think that like like I think that like I give this show like props for essentially being daring to kind of I guess put like a slight twist onto it. I still do think that the like both of us are predicting like it's gonna end up being kind of cookie cutter like the outcome
Yeah.
of it like I mean and so the thing to watch will still just be like exactly how it executes within those
Yep.
bounds and
Yep.
so
Yep.
yeah
Yep. Yep.
like but yeah definitely some good stuff and yeah I think the hype behind this show has been backed up and yeah I mean it's pretty solid. Alrighty.
Yeah, so we'll be moving on to number 4, which is still a taxi. I gave it a score of 6.8. You gave it a score of 5, with a rolling average of 6.31. So it slightly went down. Your thoughts, since your score is a little bit lower than previous weeks.
Yeah. I think this was one of the okay, this was I felt like okay, so it's a mystery show and I felt like there was a
Yes.
decent amount there's always like a decent amount of okay, here's mechanical plot move forward that type of stuff. I feel like this was the first one where like it just seemed very let me put it like this. Like it seems like very like okay, here's they've done plenty of like plot advancing, but I think outside of plot advancing, this is the first episode where I felt like there wasn't like as much, shall I say, like brutally honest character diving. And to be fair, like I think that like a show like this, like it is also one of the things where it's like you can't expect a show to like every week just deliver like super crazy punches, but like this was the first one where like I didn't walk away with noticeably being like oh damn, like we like got to like see some like like really like the deep way somebody thinks, like the type of thing. Like I felt like that was like a little bit missing from it. Okay, yeah, well,
So I still gave this a rather high, like on the
yeah,
higher end, right?
yeah,
I think because what the beauty of this show, at least
okay,
early on,
yeah,
according to the both of us,
yeah,
was its writing, right? It was
yeah,
very sharp,
yeah,
very tact
yeah,
in a way. What I liked about this episode was uh, still the writing. I really
okay,
enjoyed the. So I agree that in terms of character development, there was not
yeah,
development per se.
yeah,
I think there was more character building.
yeah, okay, fair enough.
So for example, when Odokawa figures out that the llama girl, I forgot her name,
Okay,
is paying back a debt, and that's
okay,
what she's doing this. Like he realized
yeah,
she's not being forced; she's actually doing it on her own will,
yeah,
and and she's the one that he likes, right? And is
yeah,
protecting. So now there's a new twist here. It's like okay, he didn't want to tell the monkey person
yeah,
about her, but then now he realized, wait, she's actually the one reaching out to him. So like,
yeah,
do I actually like her that much anymore?
okay,
So that's
okay,
that was like, oh, that's cool.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
new like depth to it. Same with the other monkey character. What's his name? The really stupid disillusioned
okay,
guy
yeah,
who took out a freaking
yeah,
loan
yeah,
to
took out
take
freaking
the
loan
girl
just to
out.
impress a college girl. It's like dog, like this, it's like
She,
it's
yeah,
so
he's right
dumb, like,
next to batshit crazy
Yeah.
raccoon boy
Yeah.
in terms of like characters that
Yeah.
I hate.
Yeah. But it's like I do think that like, once again, like I do think that like this show, once again, it's like the characters are just like really well done, and like the fact that I can feel this much disdain towards him, like in my book it's still kind of like okay, it's not obviously not quite as amazing as like Joffrey level in Game of
Yeah,
Thrones, like
yeah,
level where it's just like I hate the guy, but it's like damn, it's amazing. But yeah, like it is a show where it's like, oh, like the characters are compelling enough to the point where like there's a decent amount of emotional investment. And yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I'm still very bullish on the show, right? It's like, it's still maintaining its number 4, and I think that like, yeah, I mean, like, come the beauty of this show is that even if there isn't a lot of character diving like we were talking about, right? Even if there
Hmm.
wasn't like a lot of diving, even the premise alone and like the fact that like the blocks continue to move forward like still gives you something
Yeah,
to
yeah,
watch for.
yeah.
Yeah,
They
right.
they still haven't touched. I mean, they touched it, but they still
Okay.
have not revealed who Otokawa is
Okay.
standing
Yeah.
way at
Yeah.
his house.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's like there's like still enough moving pieces where you're just like, damn, like I want to watch it anyways, right? And like I do have a
Hmm.
feeling that like these type of episodes where like they end up not going that hard, like it might be more of an exception than the rule. And overall though, it's still like I said, like this does fall into the category of like show where I'm just like super tempted to just click next and just continue to watch because I'm like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm excited to see all the moving parts cascade into the
yeah,
finale.
exactly, right. Like it's like, yeah, definitely a pleasure to watch. For those of you who may not have started on it yet, even though this hasn't breached top 3, it's still, consistently. I think it's like, been number 4 or 5 the entire time.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
like
Yep.
it's there for good reason because I still think it's like incredibly. It's like I would argue it's almost like a master class in terms of like storytelling. Like, yeah, storytelling chops. Like that, I would say that like, yeah, it's just a very simplistic. Or not, I can't say simplistic, but it's a very not super extraordinary setting slash like setup, but it's still
Hmm.
just storytelling so well that you're like, oh damn, like I gotta watch it. Like
Yeah.
I just gotta keep watching. Alrighty. At number 5, Koikomo. Manassas gave a score of 5.8. I gave it a score of 5, and the rolling average was 6.01 this week.
Yeah, this one was interesting. So from the get go, in terms of animation, it was a little bit on the lower end for me because there's a lot of skill. If you pause at the correct moments, you could
Okay.
tell that like a noob animator animated it because like the shapes of the
Okay.
faces
Yeah.
were weird, the eyes were all crossed,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and there's also some CG scenes in this show. And the
Yeah.
show doesn't
Mm-hmm.
typically use CG, and
Yes.
there is. So
Mm-hmm.
you can tell that that whatever happened
Yeah.
backstage, whether it be
Mm-hmm.
because of scheduling issues or money
Yeah.
issues, they like hired some off person to do it, and
Yeah.
animation went down.
This is
Uh,
the yeah, no,
what are you
definitely.
gonna say?
And this is I was just gonna like jump in really quick. This is it was noticeable enough to the point where this is the first week out of this show I've actually noticed something. Like I'm generally like a little bit, I would say like a little bit less pick. I think my standards are a little bit less picky about animation in comparison to
Hmm.
yours. And like the fact that I
Yeah,
noticed it this week is like kind of tells you it's like, oh yeah, something wonky was happening with the animation.
yeah. So there's already that
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
peg it down. Initially, the first half of this episode, I was questioning questioning the purpose of Tamaru as a character.
Yeah.
Because I was like, he doesn't
Yeah.
really do much. He doesn't really
Yeah.
act as a foil like he was
Yeah.
intended to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that kind of changes at the end, right?
Yeah.
At the end, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, he's actually a serious contender for the main character.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
At that point, I'm like, okay, I understand his purpose now.
Yeah.
Though it's kind of weak to. It
It
took a
was,
while to set it
yeah.
up there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I think that this is one of those. I think this is. I mean, this is kind of like I guess like to be expected, and you as a viewer should expect it from Slice of Life. But this was another show where I felt like it just like solidly kind of almost like landed in its groove and like nothing like particularly noticing
yeah.
like happened
Hmm.
towards the end. I would say like there's a little bit of stuff where it's like, oh, okay, interesting. It's like, yeah, essentially like you pointed out, like, oh, now it's like they've really developed this like Tamaru character finally to be like, we've nailed him down as a foil. Like, like
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
like he's in the main poster for a reason. Like, it's like, okay, like there should be something. And like, but yeah, it's like I think that it's finally there. But outside of that, I think that it's another one of the shows where I felt like it just kind of fell victim to like slice of life, like just really like in the groove type of thing, and there wasn't too much that stood out about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think had it not been for the ending where
Yeah.
she started comparing the two,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
it wasn't until then where I was like, wow, this episode is gonna have tank really bad. But
Yeah.
then that
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, there's these two perspectives. I'm like, okay,
Yeah. Okay.
I
Yeah.
understand it
Exactly.
now.
Yeah. Exactly. Like it would have definitely gotten like a much lower score had that ending scene not showed up. I do think that this is one of the ones where now that I'm thinking about it, I think there are 3 episodes where I literally kind of thought, meh for most of the episode, and then like at the end I was like, oh, that was actually a pretty good moment.
Hmm.
So yeah, still decently solid. Okay.
So we have another movement in the top eight. We have Shadow's House at number six. It moved up by one. I gave it a score of 6.3. You give it a score of 6 for a rolling average of 5.86. What are your thoughts on this episode?
Um, I do kind of like now how there's more story progression. Okay, like we finally are
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
understand a little bit more of that stuff. I do think it's the show. There's a little bit of cracks that are coming out where it's like the show tries really hard to essentially be like this, have this like really deep explanation and like kind of stuff, and I felt like it was almost like a little bit too rushed on this episode where it's like, oh, like here's like supposedly a lot of depth that I felt like was just kind of all of a sudden shoehorned in without like plenty of context, and then they like try to like
So
make it
what would
this
be
like,
an example?
so like for example, like okay, like the whole like interaction. It's like, oh, like the dolls are now debuting, right? It's like, oh, like it would have been nice to like see a little bit more, or maybe explain a little bit more of that. I mean, okay, it is almost kind of addressed in the show a little bit where like Kate just like
Yeah, yeah.
straight up doesn't like tell her about it until then, and it's like so you kind of gets like, oh yeah, like they didn't think about it, but it is almost like a little bit of whiplash where it's like, oh, like now you're showing me a big bunch of this new content, and like it's supposed to like, okay, I would argue that the strength of the show has always been that like it the pacing of it has almost forced you to really think kind of deeply about like here's kind of like what the show's trying to like tell you about in terms of like, oh, like like what does it mean to be like like a human and all that type of stuff. And
Hmm.
this one was the one where it's like, oh, like there was enough whiplash to the point where it felt like I couldn't like 100% like just sit in there and just relish in that when I was more focused on like, oh, okay, here's some like new mechanical thing that's happening, here's a new mechanical thing that's happening, here's a new mechanical thing that's happening. That being said, I don't think it's that big of a deal, which is why it still got like a pretty good score. Like yeah, like
Hmm.
I like this, it is a minor thing I think to look forward to, where, or I guess like like an interesting point to look forward to now that like they seem to be ramping up the mechanical plot points, like as they kind of like move that forward.
Yeah.
It's like you're gonna be interesting to see if it's just gonna start to focus on that a little bit more so than I would say almost like it is like at times a little bit difficult. I mentioned this comment last week where I was like, saying that like, oh, like this is one of the shows that end up like usually saving for last to watch because I feel like it's a lot to take in when you watch that show.
Hmm.
But it's like, but the fact that it makes it feel like there's a lot to take in was kind of the charm in the previous episodes. And like I'm starting to see like a tiny swing towards like just more of like, oh, here's mechanical plot points advancements, like a little bit. Like I said, it's not big enough of super big enough of a concern to the point where like I'm just like docking an incredible amount of points, but it is something to watch out for.
Yeah. So I actually do like the route they took. So
Okay.
we like slingshot right
Yeah.
towards the debut.
Yeah.
I didn't really think about it. Think about the whiplash. I guess
Okay.
maybe because all some of the other shows kind of never progressed, whereas this show
Yeah.
actually just
Yeah.
like full on sent like,
Yes,
yeah, let's
exactly.
go
Yeah.
straight to the debut.
Yeah.
And I think the two biggest charms of this show, in my opinion, are one the setting, right? It's a very
Yeah.
like gothic
Yeah.
era esque world, as well as all the mysteries about the mechanics of the
Yeah.
shadows and the dolls, and that's always been its two strong points, in my opinion. And so we're getting to see a little bit more of shadows and their relationship with their dolls apart from Kate and Emilio,
Yeah.
right? And that was always something that we're like, ooh, can we see more
Yeah.
of someone else? And so it's
Yeah.
nice to see that.
Yeah. That's-
And just like every other previous like episodes for this show, it's
Yeah.
like it always ends with some sort of cliffhanger. You kind
Yeah.
of want to know more about this world.
Yeah.
Like who's Edward? Why doesn't he have a shadow? Or who is his shadow?
Yeah.
I'm betting it could be grandfather, whatever his
Yeah.
name is.
I think it might
And
be
yeah.
grandfather. And then there's also that interesting thing where he goes like, "What are you doing? Spit out the sweets." And I was like, "What the hell is that?" Like, and when
Oh, really?
when he
I
so
thought-
so
I
so
thought
when
he
he
s-
walks out, I'm pretty sure that's what he said, right? Was
I think it's like go and just enjoy the sweets. That's not what I
Oh,
thought he said.
really? Oh, okay. Like, anyways, he like says some weird comment to one of the dolls, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that was. Like, I couldn't fully understand it, and I think that's what the show intended. It was like, oh, like what did he actually mean by that when he said that? Like,
There's also a scene in the middle where he was like, one of the shadows was like telling him, "You can't treat me like that."
Yeah.
And he's like, "I'm a special doll."
yeah,
I guess you guys don't understand that yet.
Yeah.
And I was like, interesting. So there is, because for the most part, we always thought the shadows were on top of the dolls, but
Yeah.
it seems like he has a special status for whatever reason, and he's actually higher than these low tier dolls,
I
shadows.
yeah, and I think that statement there like makes me think it's like, oh, like he directly has, like the ultimate patriarch
Influence.
of the whole thing, like maybe it's related to grandpa or something like that. And like in the end, like
Mm-hmm.
it still kind of makes sense because like, okay, sure, if you're technically a mirror, but if you're a mirror for like the most important person, then like yeah, you're probably more important than like some little kids,
Some of
like some
yeah,
little
I
shadows.
agree.
Yeah, yeah. And so
And I think this will be the first extended time where the shadows are apart from the dolls. So we'll
yes.
see
Mm-hmm.
how they interact.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see that. Yeah. Alrighty. At number 7, we have Tokyo Revengers. Went up one spot. Manatsu gave a score of 5.8. I gave a score of 6 to give it a rolling average of 5.76.
Yeah. So this one was really interesting. It talked a little bit about what happens when he goes back and
Yeah.
forth, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
he goes back in time,
Yeah.
and the opening scene is him about to do it with this random chick.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of figure out, oh, when he goes back to the present, his former self and his former personality kind of takes over
Yeah.
for that, which
Mm-hmm.
is very interesting. I never even thought about that,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that they gave us that
Yeah.
info.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like the so now right, his mission is to prevent Draken
Yeah.
from
From
passing
dying.
away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we got a lot of character development of Mikey and trying to figure
Yeah.
out who he
Mm-hmm.
is. Not much action, which is whatever, but more
Yeah.
story progression and more character development progression from Mikey.
Yeah.
Uh yeah, that's all I had. I mean, I give it a
Okay.
5.8, which is I think lower than I did the previous weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And that's because it wasn't as intense as
Yeah.
previous weeks, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion.
Yeah, I will say
Um,
what ended up giving me like a decent score for this one was I think the interaction with Drake and Mikey and then the girl's parents at the hospital.
Parents.
That was like a pretty interesting like nuanced scene where essentially Draken actually just straight up pushes Mikey's head down and it's like, oh, like you see like it is I mean the narrator kind of does spell it out like very
Mm-hmm.
explicitly for the viewer, but it's like, oh, like this is kind of like why losing Draken eventually equates to Mikey losing his humanity per se, right? And I think that
Yeah.
that was, yeah. This show continues to just be like, I think it's one of those. I think number one, it delivers fantastically on the premise, and I think that as
Mm-hmm.
the show goes forward and forward, like this is one of the shows where I feel like the way it's set up, like it's probably gonna get better and better. And so I'm definitely like, yeah,
Yes.
I'm definitely like
Yes.
looking at this show with like a very, very, very bullish, very
Yeah. I
excited look.
it was funny how when the main character was like, "Oh, can't I just tell her that she's gonna die in the future and then that will prevent it all?" And he's like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, you think she's gonna believe you?" I'm glad they didn't take that route
Yeah.
because like it is a cheap way out, right?
Yeah, and
And
okay, like it is like nice that they almost kind of like address that because I was like, yo, like
yeah,
it is kind of like dumb that like the kid believed it and like sure, okay, saying that like, oh, he was just really into essentially like
cult stuff,
like yeah,
right?
cold stuff. It's like it's kind of like a weak explanation, but at least it kind of got addressed. And I do think
Yeah.
that it is a nagging thought in the back of any viewer's mind, like if you kind of like really think a lot about the show. So I did appreciate that moment. Yeah, it was decent. Yeah.
What are your predictions? Because I already have predictions of what's gonna happen.
Ooh, okay. I think it's gonna end up in a scenario where he has to choose because he can't save everyone. I think that it's gonna be
Okay.
like, I think it's not gonna be like a very, in the end, everything's gonna be happy type of thing.
Yeah, I don't think the show is set up to be that.
Yeah, I don't
All right.
think it's gonna be that. I'm not. I have like some theories, but I'm not like super as dead set on them as let's say like the 86 perspectives are,
Mm-hmm.
or 86 predictions are. Like, but I like have a couple of theories in my head, but I'm not
Yeah,
as strong on them.
the thing that pops out to me was there was a scene that they flash back to
Okay.
towards the end of the episode.
Hmm.
They flash back to his friend, the red-haired guy,
Yeah.
when they were having conversation on the rooftop,
Yeah.
where he said Draken was not supposed to
Yeah.
die,
Hmm.
and that wording, I'm not sure if it's a translation
Yeah. Yeah.
difference,
Like.
but
Hmm.
the word "supposed to" is it an interesting word to include?
Oh, like maybe like he was like intended to be wounded, but like not supposed to actually be
So yeah,
killed. Like
there's that
the
one. He was intended to be
intentionality. Okay, yeah.
wounded,
Yeah.
or it was supposed to be someone else.
Yeah, like they're trying to kill somebody
He
else and
wasn't
he
supposed to
accidentally.
die.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So belief is that someone else was supposed to die, but Draken being the guy that he is, it makes sense
Uh,
that he's the one that would like
okay. Yeah.
sacrifice himself. Like he would block it
Okay.
for someone. At
Yeah.
least that's my theory right now, and I think
Mm.
it'll be addressed pretty soon.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, eventually, is it like Mikey's just actually like such a fucking psycho that like maybe they're trying to overthrow him and he steps in to save him? Bob, like, who knows, right? There's gonna be like,
Hmm.
there's definitely some stuff to see there. Alrighty.
Yeah.
And at
So
number 8, we have Mars Red. This one dropped a pretty noticeably. I think Manatsu gave a score of 4.8. I gave it a score of 4, and the rolling average is now 5.66. I think this was to kind of speak to the lens of drama. I think that I brought up last week. This was the first episode. This is the first one where I was just like, okay, you didn't deliver on that front. I don't know. I feel like it's like all the previous episodes, like, okay, if your premise and like kind of like the storytelling is all a little bit more hammed up dramatic, like I want some like big emotional payout. Even if I think that the buildup wasn't quite earned. For example, like okay, the masked boy and the prostitute, right? It's like okay, like sure, like
yeah,
maybe it wasn't built up like properly all the way, but like it was still kind of like a moment
it
that
was
made
there.
you think. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a moment that made you think. This is the first one where it's just kind of like and like I do think that like this episode ends up kind of focusing a little bit more on like the ass pull, like okay, it's not 100% ass pull because they did kind of mention a little bit, but like kind of like these all of a sudden these like here's like these like new elite units coming out of nowhere and like
Yeah.
that's like the new thing. It's kind of like okay, like it feels like a little bit unearned. It's like and like my
Mm-hmm.
my opinion of it is like okay, like you watch K dramas not for the plot because the plot's always like kind of
Yeah.
meh like at best.
Normal or
Yeah,
like
like kind of like
cliche,
meh
whatever.
at best, and like so this is like one of those where like oh like they just end up trying to like introduce some like cool plot point. I'm like that's like not the strength of the show, and it never has been. And like I like still think it's like oh them trying to deliver this just like fell short of the mark, and so that's why I gave it a 4. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on it?
I mean 4.8 was lower than I usually give it, or
Yeah.
maybe it might be the same. I'm not sure,
Okay.
but yeah, I was a little bit confused with the plot.
Yeah.
It's kind of so I
Scattered all
don't
over the
even
place.
remember why Maeda-san was in the hospital. That
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm.
Then he goes to the theater to meet up with the white boy who's also a
Yeah.
vampire, right?
Yeah.
And we knew from earlier episodes
Yeah.
that he was probably a vampire because
Yeah.
the other guy with the mask was like,
Yeah.
why
There's
is a guy
strong
like him
presence,
here,
yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah. But then they just recognize each other and that's it. Like nothing really happens. Like what the heck was that?
Yeah,
Like
it's
why?
like yeah, it's just like I said, it's like they introduce. It's like I said, like I never watched the show for like okay, like the plot's like has to be there right to like kind of engage you as a story, but like that was never like the main focus point, right? It's like always like for me like what was enjoyable is kind of like the bigger moments, right? It's like oh like I think it was like, episode 2 where like like we see his decision to like mercy kill his squad member.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was like oh shit, like really made you think type of
Yes,
stuff. Like
the interactions between humanity and the
yeah,
human with the against the vampire, right? And
yeah.
the
Yeah,
conflict between those two.
yeah, right. It's like, oh, like I mean, like this episode is like, oh, I like tried to catch in a little bit. I guess like previously cashed in chips. I felt like it's like you already kind of cashed in the chips, or like you like found the letters from like the opera singer girl, like, and then
Yeah.
they're like trying to make it. I'm like, okay, like, hold up, you guys have already like played that card and like make me like like feel about
Yeah.
it. So I felt like it was kind of like okay, like nice try, but come again, like you already used this card, like, but yeah, it does
Yeah.
kind of like do like a callback for like I like thought the first episode, like I said, like even though it was like kind of too dramatic a little bit, but it was like oh like there was still something there, right? Or it's like like the previous episode where like he talks to his wife and they have this whole one of the guys Matsuda,
Yeah,
the
that
guy
was
talks to his
nice. And
wife,
it's
and I
like a
was
sweet story.
yeah, and I was like, oh shit, like okay, that's not bad. Yeah, like the masked guy visiting the prostitutes. Like there's always kind of like this moment where it's like, ooh, like it makes you feel, and you're like, okay, all right, like, and that was just like this episode, like just clearly lacking. Like I said, like almost feels a little bit asshole because like some of these things aren't like established super well, and like yeah, they're kind of mentions. It's not like true asshole, but it's like yeah, like you said, it's like oh like how to like the reason he's in the hospital is because he like had the heart thing imaging, by the way, but like the fact that you didn't remember it from the previous episode is kind of like just kind of goes to show where it's like oh like the storytelling's already kind of like disjointed to begin with. And, like, you're not sure exactly who these new people are, how like when you went to the theater, those two guys just instantly recognize each other, and then like now this like new elite vampire unit or whatever from England is kind of like okay,
like,
kind of came out of left field. Like what is this? Like yeah. So,
yeah, and so I just checked, and this is the biggest drop of any show.
Okay.
So 0.32 is the biggest drop.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping the tone kind of switches. Like I said, unfortunately, this show almost like gave me like a warning sign where like, oh, they focus too much on just kind of like mechanical plot advancements is kind of like it was never the strong point to begin with, and then like I'm not
Yeah.
too hopeful about it, but we'll see about it. We'll see what happens in the
Yeah, I
future.
on my prediction it gets out of the top 8 next week
Yeah.
because I think
Hmm.
there are some shows that are starting
Yeah.
to pick up. So
Alrighty.
yeah, that ends our top 8, and now we're gonna talk about the middle 8. We're gonna do the same format as before. We're gonna
Yeah.
take turns talking about it to kind of just
Yeah.
save us the time. Do you want to take the next? Do you want to take the first one or the second one?
I guess we'll take the first one. It's fine.
All right, go
Alrighty.
for it.
Alrighty. At number 9, we have Don't Toy With Me, Miss Nagatoro. Master gave a score of 5.2. I gave a score of 5. The rolling average went down by zero point 0.1 to 5.5. I think that, it was. I will give it credit and say that it didn't slide too much for being as slice of lifey as it is. It didn't slide
Mm-hmm.
too much, but it's still very within, I guess, the groove of like, oh, here's a very prototypical story. It didn't deviate too much from it. I will say that there are enough moments in there where it's kind of like, oh, like this is nice, but
Yeah, I
yeah.
agree.
Alrighty. Number 10.
All right, at number 10 is Burning Kabaddi. Also went up by 1 spot. I give it a 5.8. You give it a 4 for a score of 5.41. So the rolling average slightly went down by
Yeah.
0.13. I think with this, it's almost the same. At least my comments on it
Yeah.
is almost the same, where it's very crisp animations.
Yeah.
Very crisp. I think it's one of the better animated um, shows out there. We get more of the rules, and I think the character development, just bringing it back, talking about the hat trick, and we see the character development of the main character. It's like, oh, that's pretty nice, and I think just really that there's not that much of a weakness, at least to me. Oh, okay. The big weakness is when they run out of mechanics. But
Yeah.
it's already going towards matches. Like they're actually doing
Yeah.
practice matches this time. So now they're trying to pivot away from, okay, you kind of know the mechanics, so let's kind of pivot towards the intensity of like an actual match.
Yeah, I will say for me personally, like it is. I ended up like kind of being like, ah, damn, like this show. I feel like it's almost going into like the almost shonen esque, like really focus on powers type of stuff, where it's like, oh, like and that, like kind of rubbed me a little bit. It's like, oh, like let's just focus on the sport type of thing. Like I felt like the new swimmer character, whoever, it's like the amount of time they focus on like the whole like, oh, he's like part of the water, but he came to the land to play. It's like, dude, like come on, guys, like what the, like man, like it's just like it feels like, yeah, I don't know. Anyways, so decent. All right. Number 11, Yasuke. You gave it a score of 5.2. I gave it a score of 5. The rolling average 5.38. I think Yasuke, it continues to be a pretty interesting premise. I think that it was a little bit more I think that for the first half it was a lot more untangling than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like untangling of kind of what happened in the previous episode. Seeing a little bit of the fight scenes were pretty decently, I think it was pretty decently done, where essentially it's the priest and his crew all gang up on Yasuke at the bar and all that type of stuff. It's interesting. I think that there still remains a lot to be told, but I mean it's like I think that there's enough meat in kind of like these early episodes where it's like, oh, like it's like there's stuff to look forward to. I think that I definitely, in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is still early on, so kind of keep that in mind. Where's the other shows? Alrighty,
All right,
number
at number
12.
12 with the biggest jump
Yeah.
by 9 spots is To Your Eternity. This episode I gave my high score at 7.8.
Okay.
You gave it a 6 for a rolling average of 5.25, and this is also the highest jump of any show for the
Alrighty.
rolling average, which is 0.41.
Yeah. Tell me more about your high score.
Yeah. So I think a part of the reason why I gave this high score was because I gave it such low scores earlier on
Okay.
because of how slow the pacing was.
Yeah.
We kind of finally have our big push for character development for the main character with
Yes.
the death of March.
Mm-hmm.
I think I need to read the manga because I don't think there were pictures of March imagining herself to be older. So that's anime
Oh.
new. It could
Okay.
be. I have to recheck it.
Yeah.
And I think from all the character development and all the time dedicated for this March character,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of pays off because okay, we finally see the first real emotional death because the human dying episode, the wolf dying episode one, whatever. The human dying episode one, I didn't.
I personally thought it was whatever. Yeah. Although I've
Yeah.
heard from what you said, like people are legit
Yeah,
bawling at it.
March,
like,
I think it makes more sense. There's more
Yeah.
depth to her death,
Mhm.
and the big ending that I finally, that we all get to see,
Yeah.
right, is that the main character can now transform into March.
Yeah, and I think it is the final acquisition of humanity where it's like okay, like I get that like oh like the narrator's trying to be like oh kakui like oh this is like shit's so cool like you know like it's like
Mm-hmm.
this like being or whatever, but like it was still almost like borderline a little bit like like to like see this just as being just walk around, and like the fact that now he's acquired humanity, right? It's
Yeah.
he's acquired humanity, and I think that's a huge thing where I was like oh damn like okay, alrighty, like this is gonna set up for some pretty epic stuff.
And this is the primary, I'd say, bread and butter of this show.
Okay. Yeah.
The fact that he finally can transform to March, it opens like a big box of stuff that this show could like. I mean, I know
Yeah.
what happens, but
Yeah.
for you as a viewer who
Yeah.
don't know what's gonna happen, anything can happen, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I think like previously it's like oh like it like imprinted the biological like the strictly biological okay like not even a strict biological because it's like you know biological certain cherry picking biological things but like it never like
Yeah.
encapsulate humanity, and it's like now it's like we finally you know when like it like stops when he stops the older sister from killing herself, and then he has March's
Yeah.
pal. I was like, oh damn, that actually kind of that's a feels bad. I
Yeah.
was
We're
like,
finally
shit,
getting
yeah,
some deep stuff.
yeah, yeah. I was like, oh shit, that actually does feel kind of bad when he like does March's pal. I was like, oh gosh, man, that's some shit. I was like, yeah, I was
Yeah.
like, oh, that's something else. Yeah, I like,
Yeah, so I have high hopes for this show now. Now that we're
yeah,
finally here,
hmm
oh my goodness, we're about to hit the roller coaster.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's you know we scored it this week significantly higher than all the previous scores that we gave it. I think
Yep.
you know because you know, it was earned. Yeah. Okay. Number 13, Studio Super Club. You gave a score of 4.8. I gave a score of 5. Rolling average went down by 0.08 to now 5.21. I will say, this show almost like the way this episode played out almost made me realize like how kind of like okay how sure mainly comfy short hair girl is, but like I like
Mm-hmm.
also realized it's like oh damn like she is kind of like really one dimensional, and like I like did like that like
Yeah.
no okay because they introduced now a more dynamic character, then you're like oh wait a second
Uh-huh.
like I like didn't realize how boring the previous girl was, and like okay now I'm hoping with Super Comp like that they just focus on different girls as the show kind of goes through,
Yeah,
and then like
there's still a third girl
yeah,
there,
there's still a
right?
third girl that like we don't know yet, and like yeah, it's like hopefully you know like this ends up like you know kind of being the mechanic, and like it kind of ends up being cool. Yeah, it's still I think that it's like it is definitely like now still with that being said with like kind of a more dynamic character, it's still very like well within the right. I think most of the moments are almost kind of like redeemed towards the end of the episode where they finally like you know layer
Yes.
on some emotional context to it, and like it feels nice, but like it's also just you know like it's a very middle of the road. It's kind of like the best way to describe it.
I agree.
Alrighty, number
All right,
14.
number
Yep.
14 is Farewell, My Dear Kramer. Went down one spot. I gave it a score of 4.8. You gave it a score of 5 for a rolling average of 5.18. This is a show that, at least for me, is a little bit snowballing in the
Yeah.
wrong direction.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, it's just, there's not that many things I'm looking forward to or rooting
Yeah.
for. There's just a lot of, I think a part of the problem is that there's just so many characters to track, and
Yeah.
we're not really deep diving any
Into
of the
any of them.
characters. I
Yeah.
think in the first or second episode, I think it focused on one or two episodes
Yeah.
of each, which is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
But this time it's like all over the place.
Yeah. Like a buckshot. Yeah. Like,
Yeah, I have no
yeah.
idea what they're doing, and I think a part of what is supposed to sell this show is the
Yeah.
fact that the narrator, who is from the future,
Yeah.
who's retelling the story, is like
Yeah.
saying how a lot of these characters are going to be professional soccer
Yeah.
players. They're going to be the best of the best.
Yeah.
Like, oh, little did we know that
Yeah.
this was
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
the rise. Little did we know that the best
Yeah.
player in Japan will rise. But like, I'm not interested in this story right now.
Yeah.
And so, how are you going to keep me up with
Yeah.
this show when there's no excitement for it? I think
Yeah.
the humor is a little bit weak. I think the action is non existent since they're not playing soccer at the moment.
Yeah.
So, there's not anything they're doing well right now.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. Alrighty, number 15. Joran and the Princess of Blood and Snow. You gave a score of 5.8. I gave a score of 5. The rolling average went up by 0.06 at 5.16. This episode I think it was some of my concerns last episode about like, oh, they just closed up that storyline. It's like, what now? I think they spent this episode addressing exactly that, which is very satisfying to me as a viewer. It's like, okay, good.
Yeah.
At least you're doing that. I do think that the premise gets it still continues to be like being pretty interesting. I think that you know it's there wasn't too much. I think personally, just like this episode itself, spent a lot of time almost like defragging, kind of like what happened in the previous episodes, and so like there wasn't that much else
Mm-hmm.
going on. But I do think that the premise is now pretty solid. Of like, oh, like essentially here's a woman who had a big bunch of passion, and then now like it goes from just like almost borderline drama esque like Mars Red level of like just like crazy passion drama stuff to all of a sudden now it's like, oh, I feel empty, but then there's still this war going on. You have like the woman who lost her arm, or the guy woman who lost his arm, and like like he's
Yeah.
like, oh, like I still feel like I have to be part of the main stage, like so there's this sense of like, oh, like I still have a place in society, and they're kind of starting to explore that aspect of it where it's like, oh, like I may not want to be a puzzle piece, but I am still a puzzle piece, and so like that mechanic is like it's gonna hopefully be explored a little bit more, and so yeah, there's definitely still a lot of potential there.
Yeah. Is it funny from I found the first arc, I call it the
Yeah, yeah,
Janome
yeah,
arc. I found the whole arc confusing because I had no idea what
yeah.
was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm actually happy that they're done with
Ah,
that
okay.
arc.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, yeah. Um,
Alright, the last show to be safe from the Gauntlet is The Way of the House Husband at number 16. It dropped 2 spots. I gave it a score of 4.10, which is actually my lowest score this week, and you gave it a score of 5 for a rolling average of 5.15. And the reason why this show got my lowest score is I think the comedy, which is what it really is all, right, is it's starting to run a little dry for me.
okay.
It's
Yeah.
it's not as funny as it used to be. I don't laugh as hard. There's not that much. It's really hard for me to see character development, really, and so it's
Okay.
hard for me to root for stuff. And I think just the repetition and the fact that it's like very small snippets, I think I'm starting to grow tired of it.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I think this is the last episode. I guess just as a showrunner's note. It is I think it pretty much delivered as squarely as it could have. It's exactly like one particular line of humor that is just repeated throughout. And yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, I think this is, to be honest, like after I think by episode 2, this is kind of like what I was expecting, and it's just kind of like, oh, this is it. And so yeah, this show is done. In terms of runtime, so this will no longer be included in future episodes, because well, it's done.
Is
So
that
yeah,
yeah?
yeah,
So now we are down to the bottom 6, which are the shows that we can potentially eliminate from the Gauntlet. Again, we're changing the format to make it the bottom 6 because we have less shows, so we want to really highlight the bad shows,
yeah,
quote unquote bad shows.
yeah. Alrighty, for bottom 6. Full Dive. This ultimate next gen full dive RPG is even shittier than real life. You gave a score of 4.8. I gave it a score of 4, and so the rolling average dropped by 0.15 to a score of 5.01. I think this episode was actually okay for the most part, and then it got like super hard on me at the end when
Yep.
and I was just like, dog, like this is just like, okay, you're trying to tell me that this is supposed to be an Isekai that's really different because, well, hey, this is more realistic, blah blah, and then you just like toss in like the most like Isekai trope possible in there. I'm just like, this is so dumb. Like, I feel like it's like for a show
I
that
also
tries
just
to
found
like,
the episode boring.
yeah,
Like it was
incredibly
okay.
boring. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, not much really happened in the show in terms of
Mm-hmm.
progression. Like he's trying to just restart his adventure after being was pardoned or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Although the people still hate him, which I think makes sense.
Yeah. But
Uh,
it's just like it's definitely like a resident sleeper one. Like I felt like I was like, jeez, like
mhm.
I was like, oh, I'm so glad the episode's over. Well, I was glad the episode's about to be over. And then they introduced that shitty thing at the end, and I was like, okay, this is like extra, like harem bullshit. Like it's like, like
Yeah, like I really like didn't need it.
yeah. Alrighty. The next one, Higa Hero. You gave it a score of 4.8. I gave it a score of 5, and its rolling average stayed the same,
Yeah.
4.91.
Funny enough, there are two or three shows that stay the same, which is pretty impressive considering we're 5 weeks into the averages. This episode was interesting to me. It was a very dialogue-heavy episode. Not much movement all around. We see the interactions of Goto with Sayu, and it's cool. I think the cool part of this episode was that Goto was the one that could really understand where Sayu was coming from.
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
uh, uh, a adapt to Sayu's character is the fact that she doesn't reveal her true emotions. She kind of
Yeah.
hides it,
Mhm.
mostly because like in the past she has to sell her body to like live and sleep at a
Yeah.
place, right?
Mhm.
And Goto was able to see right through that like instantly,
Yeah.
which I think is a great character development mechanic for Goto and for Sayu as well. So it
Mhm.
was nice seeing that, and then we have the episode between the conversation between the main character and the the
The
chick that
the
he
other
works
coworker.
with.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
coworker.
the coworker.
Yeah.
That conversation didn't sound convincing to me. Like it felt really flat, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
It was one of those where like I was like really happy to see them run into each other because I was like, oh, I want to explore this a little bit more. And then it's
Yeah,
just like the most like,
useless thing. Like
yeah,
you kind of already talked
yeah,
about these things
it's
before.
like it's let me put it like this. Like this is kind of like a theme that I sometimes talk about when I talk about media, specifically when I look at Eastern media and specific like this is like it's like the girls' behavior is just like the most like confusion thing where it's
Doesn't
just like
make sense,
yeah, like it's
right?
so confusion where it's like oh like like you have a track in life and the the greatest virtue in life is to not cause big ripples, right? And like that's like it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like what I felt like it just like perfectly encapsulated that girl's behavior where it's like dog like you finally have this confrontation. She literally calls him out on what's happening. She reveals her hand of him, of being this interested in him and all that. And then the conclusion is for you to do that. It's like like what was the point? Like it's like oh my gosh, like it's like it just like felt like you like took a step forward and then it just went right back. And it's just like it's frustrating. I think like okay, surprisingly, I'm gonna give it like a little bit of accuracy in saying that like okay, at least from what from my experiences in living in East Asia and like just like watching like the rest of their media, like this does it is pretty in line with like kind of how scenarios like this do end up playing out. Unfortunately, I think me as I think like admittedly like for me as a person that was raised with a Western culture, Western mindset, it's like oh like it's just like damn like what the like it's like this is so frustrating for me to watch. It's like well why but like yeah it's still like I didn't give it like a very low score because I still think that
Yeah, I
there
mean,
was like a decent
neither
amount of
did I,
depth. Yeah,
right?
it's like there's
Yeah,
still a pretty decent amount of depth to it, but
it wasn't as
yeah,
good
it
as
wasn't as
the
good.
more recent episodes.
Yeah,
Hero has always been always on the fringe because we gave it
yeah,
low scores at the beginning, and it's starting
yes,
to
yes, starting
it's
to ramp up.
always not been dropped,
Yeah,
which is great for the show. But yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think I need more realism in this
Mm-hmm.
show.
I see. Fair enough. Alrighty, number 19. You gave it a score of 5.3. I gave it a score of 4. It dropped down 2 spots. The rolling average dropped down by 0.05 to the 4.86.
Yeah, and
I
this is
personally,
Godzilla Singular Point.
yeah. I think that this Godzilla singular point. I think the novelty of the shall I say like the pseudo physics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's starting to kind of be like meh to me. It's like okay, like it's okay, like
Mm-hmm.
I think that okay, like I think it was interesting for them to try to address this, right? Like to
Yeah.
try to sling this in. I'm not gonna claim that I'm like super like knowledgeable when it comes to physics, but like it is now like where they're leaning a lot into the quote unquote mechanics of the pseudo physics, and it's just like it just doesn't stack up. Like it just like
Interesting.
yeah, so it's okay. It is kind of one of the things where it's like okay, now it's like not to say that the previous episodes ones is like oh like physics as we understand it, but it's like they're continuously pushing the envelope. They spend a decent amount of time like pushing the envelope forward, and it's like okay, dude, like this is just so far from our current understanding of physics. Don't get me wrong, maybe who knows, maybe this show's gonna be a genius and like actually predict the future, kind of like whatever. But like it's like for at least for the time being, it's kind of like okay, you spend a lot of time trying to focus on that, and it's kind of like eh. I will say that it is it's mildly interesting to see like the new monsters getting introduced, but
Yeah.
it's also kind of like okay, like to me, like the other big thing, it's like okay, like telling me that like these logical scientist dudes, his first reaction was that oh he's looking into the future. Like dog, like how do you get to that like point from where it's like oh he
Yeah.
deflected a bullet? It's like
Yeah.
dude, like literally that just like doesn't make sense that you're drawing that conclusion. And I get that like okay maybe that's what ends up happening, but like it just like takes like so much immersion on me when it's like dude like you think
Yeah.
your characters have like way too much knowledge like OPness or whatever, right? It's like okay
It would
like
make more sense if the female main character made that conjecture because
Yes,
she was the one
yes.
studying the
Yeah, like
particle.
studying a big bunch of this stuff type of stuff. Yeah, but he's just like, oh, like it's like he knew the future. It's like no, like the other guy's explanation was perfect, where he goes, oh, like he sees a something being pointed to it and just reflexively puts up a defensive stance in that area. It's like that. It's like that's like the point that you should have thought originally, and
Yeah.
then you're supposed to discover something later. But it's like no, like instantly he's just like, oh, like let's just break the dimensions of time and shit like that. It's just like, dude, what? This is like, man, this is like doesn't make any sense. It's just like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, most of the score for me is like
okay,
based off of the scientific part because that's the I'd say the most intriguing part about this show. It's not
okay,
like the characters, it's not
yeah,
the monsters. It's really the this idea of incorporating physics, metaphysics,
mm-hmm.
really, and time travel, whatever, into the story of Godzilla, right? Because I
Yeah.
don't think that was that. I don't think that has been a take that
No,
has happened before, right?
no,
That's
no,
relatively
yeah,
new.
yeah, yeah.
So that's it's great that they're adding that. I think the other convincing part about this show is that, oh, why has no one known about this particle? Oh, it's because rich corporations want to make more money, and
Mm-hmm.
they're the ones hunting down this particle. It's like, well, that makes a whole lot of sense. And if the demise of this world is because rich corporations are trying to uh, be the one to mine this mineral,
Mm-hmm.
very believable to me. That's pretty aligned to our world. So I
Yeah.
was like,
Okay.
okay, that's pretty cool. That's
Okay.
nice to have.
Yeah.
But the things that I knock it down for is characters. Like I'm not
Yeah.
really particularly attached to most of
Yeah.
the character that I'm attached to the most is the female MC, and that's
Yeah.
it. Like everyone
Mm-hmm.
has kind of side characters.
Yeah.
I hate the whole big robot edition.
Yeah.
Like
No,
I
it's
don't.
like, it's like,
It's like
dude, like
whatever.
I don't know. Like I feel like it's one of the things where it's like, oh, like Japanese people. Okay, like like anime genre loves Gundams, and so here we have a Gundam, but it's like first of all, it's not even like a real Gundam. It's like a tiny little thing. It's just kind of like,
It's
and it's like,
well, it's a play on Ultraman.
yeah, and I understand that like oh like where it is like I get that like you're telling a Godzilla story, right, and
Yeah.
I understand like this whole like aspect, like I get why it's there, but it's just like I said, like it just feels kind of like disjointed, and like I feel like as much good as the show can bring, it also just like constantly snaps you right out of the immersion based on its focus, and like it's just kind of like
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think there's just not there's not much going for it.
yeah. Alrighty. Um, at number 20, we have Pretty Boy Detective Club. You gave a score of 5.8. I gave a score of 5. And the average score went up by 0.14. I think that this was. I was honestly expecting a slightly larger payoff. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
you know how you were telling me like, oh, like like it's 2 episodes of kind of setup, and then like the third episode is
Yeah.
like okay,
Yeah.
it's a big reveal. This one has so happened to be 1 episode setup and then 1 episode of kind of like closing out. And I think that
Yeah.
because there was less time, that's kind of like less of like a build up. That being said, though, I still gave it a score that was like better than most weeks. Precisely, almost because exactly like, oh, here's the substance episode. I guess like with the storytelling
Yeah.
method,
Yeah.
like yeah, like this is a substance episode. So I just end up getting a decent score of 5. What was your reason for giving it a 5.8?
Yeah, so it was nice, tying all of her character development into
Yeah.
the way she is finally,
Mm.
it added depth to the character that I enjoyed. I didn't
Okay.
think that they were actually gonna head that direction.
Yeah.
I like the ending a lot, where it's
Okay.
like
Yeah.
the show and the first arc kind of set this up, right? Where
Yeah.
we just need to believe in this singular thing, and then
Yeah.
the show would make sense, right? So for
Okay.
her, it's the ability to see stuff that most
Yeah.
people can't see with the number high. As long as we believe this detail,
Yeah.
the arc kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
This one, we were supposed to believe that there was invisible code,
Yeah.
at least for this episode. We didn't know about the
Yes.
episode previously, but this
Mhm.
episode, and then we find out at the end that that might not be true because she took
Yeah.
out the glasses and she couldn't see him. And I thought that was cool because now we're going to the territory of like, oh, now we can't really trust like the Pretty Boy Detective Club, because for the most part we had to like whatever they said, we kind of just believed because that was the nature of the show. A lot of the show
Okay.
is a little metaphysical, so it's like
Yeah.
okay, whatever they say is true. But now it's like, oh shoot, they don't actually know what the hell they're doing, and so that for me gave me some intrigue. Like, okay, cool. Where are you gonna take this now? But you're right about there's not that big of a payoff because it was just a 2 episode arc, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, oh, okay. Then in that case, it makes sense that there wasn't much there to begin with.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, even though it's on the bottom of our list, I think that like it's trending upwards for
Yeah.
for decent reason. I think that it is. I think for viewers like me who aren't super familiar with a Monogatari-esque like storytelling, it does take a little bit of getting used to. And I can't, in good faith put this on the same level as, say like some of our top hitters, but like there's still some payoff and there is definitely like a redeemable edge to it. So yeah, I think that,
Yeah.
it's going up 2 spots makes sense. Alrighty. The next one is Let's Make a Mug 2, number 21. Went down 2 spots. You gave a score of 4.8. I gave a score of 4, and the rolling average went down by 0.1 for 4.81. Let's Make a Mug 2. What did you think of this one?
This was interesting because this episode had nothing to do with pottery. It
Yeah.
was just they ventured out, they found their teacher, and so they were like, let's snoop around and see why the teacher is here. So really, it was just a comfy excursion, and that was pretty much it. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, not really much going on. I give it points for beautifully animated and
Yeah.
colors were nice, but other
Yeah.
than that, nothing really was going.
Yeah. I felt like some of the previous episodes at least kind of had like a more heartstring pulling aspect to it that felt like just wasn't there this episode. Like it's just kind of like
It's more of a because the only emotional aspect, right, was the main character was like, wait, it was summer break, right? And she was
yeah.
supposed to do homework, whatever, but she was like,
Yeah.
I have nothing else to do, so I'm kind of bored.
Yeah.
So there was like this sense of adventure and
Yeah.
wanderlust and whatever. But other than
Yeah.
that, it's
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah, it's like very like it's like it's like you described, like it's like almost like super, it's comfy, the animation's super nice, but it's like exactly that, was just like it's like so like it's so rooted in just like here's like you know little girls in a beautiful world, and that's kind of like it as it
yeah,
almost kind of like by
yeah,
design, but that's kind of what it is. So it slid a little bit, but yeah, it's like I think that like out of the comfy shows, right? Like, so if we were to talk about comfy shows, I do think that, like, if we're gonna talk about like Super Cup versus this, like I feel like with Super Cup, like at least it delivers on some more like sure the most of the episodes comfy, but like it kind of delivers on here's like a something that happens at the end, or like a little bit more of like emotional build up or kind of like construction towards the end. I feel like this show just like it doesn't have. That being said, I also do kind of acknowledge that maybe this show was intended for like a much younger audience, and it's just like
yeah.
it's
I mean,
wholesomeness and
I think the reason why Super Cup is very it's more pleasant to watch
yeah,
is because there's conflict involved, right?
yes,
There's the characters are facing some sort
yeah,
of trial, and and this past week's episode, she was trying to confront
the
this
mountain,
challenge
yeah,
of climbing this mountain,
yeah,
and it's not like anything bad specific in terms of
yeah,
conflict, but there's a challenge there. There's
yeah,
like a sense of intensity, whereas this shit there's really not that
yeah.
much.
Like it's just like almost never has one. Like I think the Chasky bow was like the most depth I've seen in the show.
Yeah,
It's
that's
still like
cool. I like it.
yeah, like it which
Like,
is nice. Like but yeah, that's like the only moment I can honestly like walk away from the show being like, oh, I remember that. It's decent. Like, but yeah,
yeah,
otherwise it's kind of like it's just literally comfiness and not too much else. Like
yeah,
yeah.
I agree. And
Um.
now at the bottom of our list at number 22, it is Osamake. I gave a score of 4. I dropped 2 spots. I gave a score of 4.8, and you gave it the lowest score, which is 3, for this week, with a rolling average of 4.85. So why did you give it a score of 3?
I realized that, at least from my interpretation, no, last week wasn't some satirical self-understanding thing, majig. Like, I felt like that veil was blown for me, and I was just like, dude, like, it's just like, ugh, like, okay, um, I think, okay, I think the mechanic of giving her amnesia, the slight redemption edge is that there's a tiny bit of doubt of saying, like, oh, whether she actually has amnesia or not. She gets called up by a
Yeah.
Sayu, right? Sayu, yeah, she gets called up by a
Yeah.
Sayu for saying,
No,
like,
no,
oh,
not
like,
Sayu.
sorry,
Shiro.
Shiro, yeah, for saying that, like, oh, it's girl's intuition. She might not actually have it, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, I don't know. Like, it just feels like to me, it's like, it's like this, like, it wasn't like, I had the, okay. You made a pretty convincing point last week of saying
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, this
I mean,
could
I
be,
believed it at the
yeah,
time
like
too.
yeah, it's like this could be a satirical edge, and like if it's satirical edge, like that's actually pretty on the nose. Now I'm finding out like it literally was just on the nose of shittiness because in my opinion it was just shitty. Like it's just like actually that like, and so like I felt like it's like, oh, the level of complexity that you've built up in episode, mainly the confession episode, right? Like the
Yeah,
confession episode, the
yeah,
level of
yeah.
complexity you brought up there literally burned all of that shit, and like now you're like at like a starting point almost as even worse than the beginning. I don't know. I just think it's like
100%.
it's like the for example like the third girl and like this whole thing of like where she's like trying to be like this, like it just screams like this is like, let me put it like this. I personally dislike the harem genre for two reasons. Okay, number one is that I just genuinely think like in an age where, from the social issues perspective, we should not be encouraging men to have this kind of this weird toxic fantasy. That's just
I mean,
kind of
it's
just
not,
number
and it's
one.
not
Okay.
just men. No,
Yeah, yeah. It's
even
just
with
like no,
the
no, no. I mean, like reverse, right? Like, so let's talk
yeah,
reverse, right? It's like, oh, like like a girl having like 1,000 boys and stuff like that. It's the same thing where it's like, oh, like you shouldn't be setting up these levels of kind of like toxic expectation of like. But this kind of does play into the second point, where it's just like the main character almost always ends up being the passive actor, which is just like really shitty storytelling because it's like, oh, the guy doesn't
yeah,
really do anything and things are just happening to him. It just makes the show very unengaging, and that does kind of feed into the previous one where I'm saying like, oh, like it sets up like, whether it's harem or reverse harem, right? It's this expectation that, oh, you can just kind of do whatever in life and good things will just happen to you, which I think it's like a very toxic expectation to set
mm-hmm,
in like people, because it's like, oh, like you just like gonna run around like wasting away at your life and then something good happen to you, and then when it doesn't, people just end up becoming super bitter and like here's a birth of insults, guys, like like that type of stuff where it's like, oh, like we should try to like curb that a little bit, which is kind of why I don't like it like a little bit. But also, yeah, like I think that it is just like, to be very very on the point of that, it's like also just like let's not, let's like, like it's just, it is a problem storytelling. I think the main guy isn't doing much, and like I said, like I feel like it's just like, oh, the goodwill that it built up in the confession episodes now it's just being burned. It's just like a big bunch of, like, for lack of a better way to say, like super tropey things happening to him. And yeah, I was just kind of frustrated by it. What was your, give me a little bit more
yeah.
deets?
So I just like the fact that the show went like full blown harem. Not
Yeah,
like it's not like a strong harem, right?
yeah,
Where
yeah,
they're
yeah.
like gushing over him, but
Literally,
it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
almost every female character, some way or form, like likes the main character, even though he doesn't do much,
Yeah.
right? I agree with your passive character
Mhm.
discussion.
Yeah.
I still believe that Kuro, the girl that
Yeah.
has amnesia, is for like faking it all.
Yeah.
I think that's I'm still believing that.
Yeah.
But the moments in the show aren't as convincing to me. Like at the end,
Mhm.
where it's convincing that it's not convincing that this agency manager guy or whatever he
Yeah.
is
Oh, that's the other
was like
part too.
being
Yeah.
super mean to her. I was like, that doesn't make sense. I don't think people are that disrespectful, especially when you're talking to a child. I don't
Yeah.
know why you're talking to her like that. So that's number one. And then two, he finally has this courage to be like spill wine. It's like,
Yeah.
of all the times to be active, this is the time. I'm like,
Yeah. It's just,
okay, like
yeah. It's
there's
just,
nothing before that kind of informs me that you would be the type of person that does this.
yeah, and I feel like it's that moment. Okay, so number one, you did also bring up another point. I just found it so okay. Like number one, okay, anime girls all look the same, so I get that, like technically, like they could all be super cute, but like this is kind of like
Mm,
an anime. Like they aren't very uniquely animated, right? All of them have like super big eyes, like literally.
sure.
Tell me the difference between like the second girl and the third girl. Like it's like literally the same thing with like same skin with like different colored eyes and like slightly different
Hmm.
hair color. It's like they're like the same. So okay, fine. Like if they're all look the same, they could all be supermodels. But like number one, it is a little bit unbelievable. Like this quote unquote random girl gets approached by like an agency, is just like, oh, like like it's like, oh, here's like a blah blah, here's like a thing. That was kind of like a little bit weird, like kind of out of the blue. But then like you said, the part where like he like finally decides to like pour the wine on top of him, this is like perfect in my idea, in my mind, perfectly encapsulates this idea of like such a bland character that like you just like the self-insert fantasy, right? It's like he's literally so
Hmm.
generic that like you, there's no way that you can't self-insert because he never does anything so spectacular where you can like for a moment be like, oh, maybe I wouldn't be able to do that person. It's like, no, you can
Yeah,
constantly
yeah, yeah.
self-insert, and like it's just like such a cheap moment where it's like, oh, you spewed wine on him after like bullying for, it's like, what, like it came out of like just like randomly nowhere. It's like, okay, dog, like where was this Mr. Chivalry stuff? It's like it's almost like this, like grand gestures are sometimes cheap. This is kind of like my
Yeah,
personal
yeah,
philosophy
yeah.
is like grand gestures is sometimes really cheap. What makes a relationship and friendships like a lot more meaningful is like the day to day, right? It's like the things that you do, like the build up of that, right? Like a grand gesture, like sure, like it could be like indicative of something, but I feel like grand gestures are just super cheap, man. That just to me felt like it's like the ultimate like empty gesture type of thing that came out of left field, both from a storytelling perspective and also just from like a person. Like I said, like it's like the ultimate self-insert material because it's like anyone could do that, just like to like I don't
Yeah,
know, like
no,
try to
and yeah, I agree with that. I think it's just the story's starting to be less believable
Yeah.
with what they're throwing at. Like the whole confession scene,
Yeah.
it made me believe like, oh, this just show is more of about a slice of life
Yeah.
where people are just trying to figure out first loves. I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Most shows don't do it because they go past it, or they spend a long time trying to figure out who is their
Yeah.
first love.
Mhm.
So that's what I thought this show was going towards, and then now it's like half a harem, half like I have no like these kids are trying to become famous. I mean, they're partially famous, but
Mhm.
like they're trying to make a play, right?
Yeah.
Like the chick is a writer. Right, first we have to believe she's a writer,
Yeah.
and a second like she's making this movie, whatever, for him to act. And for me, it's like, wow, that's so unbelievable. And the only thing for me that I think is believable is the fact that, hey, this might actually be the life of rich people. And I just don't understand that because I'm not rich, right? You know what I mean? But I
Yeah.
don't think that's what the show is
Yeah.
going for,
Yeah.
right? I don't
Exactly.
think that's what the
Yeah.
show is going.
Yeah.
It is hilarious if this is all intended that for like, oh, this is a commentary on how rich people are so delusioned. I'm like, okay, cool. Then this show makes sense, but I don't think that was your
No.
intention.
Like yeah. And
Because if that's the case, like I totally believe like, oh, these guys are all like actors and whatnots and rich, and so it makes sense for them to be like, yeah, I can make a play, yeah, I can be a model, like, oh yeah, I can get this produced, like, yeah,
yeah,
because
it's
you're
like some
rich and
fucking random fucking
whatever.
ass pulls out of nowhere. Yeah, but it's like I feel like it's like I was convinced, and I do think in the context there was some like potentiality for it to be like, oh, watch this show end up being a self-aware like thing, and like
Yeah,
if it ended up that direction, like like I said, like a self-aware commentary on like harem tropes, a self-aware commentary on like this is how rich people are, it's just ridiculous or whatever, like then yeah, I'll give it some points. I just this episode I think cemented to me is like, oh, that's not what it was going for, and this is
it's
actually
just another
just
generic.
shitty. It's like actually shitty storytelling that like you would almost like, it's like, okay, like when you watch Gintama and like he does something super tropey and stupid, it's like it's funny because it's like, haha, get it, this happens in anime, right? If you're supposed to laugh
Yeah,
at it, it's like, and they're like, they clearly make it very obvious, like, oh, like they're not trying to lean into it or whatever. It's like, no, they spent a decent amount of time like just leaning into shit. I'm just like, okay, this is just like them actually trying to have a serious attempt at a story, and it just like ends up landing so squarely in the tropes. I'm just like, ooh, I like it. Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so that was our list of
Yeah,
bottom animes. So the drop list.
so we are in week 5, which means you are the one that will eliminate the first show. Again, we're each eliminating just a single show. I actually haven't given much thought about this yet.
Okay.
So let me think. I mean, I don't have to. You can go ahead and eliminate your first show
Yeah.
so that can help me reduce the time for me to think.
Alrighty. For my drop, I think I'm gonna take out Osmake. I think that
Okay.
it's probably not as a big surprise to you. It was the one that got the lowest score. Yeah, I just think that it's the self aware potentiality that you brought up last week. I do think in the context it made sense. Like those the potentiality of that it didn't happen. I think that like yeah, like I said, like I just think in general, just besides like I guess shall I say like the social implications of this type of storytelling, I also just find this type of storytelling very bland. And yeah, I don't see it really being able to evolve too much past that. And so out of out of all the shows, I think this one's the one that like actually left me like a like. I will say okay. I will say this show and the Full Dive kind of left me with like a shitty taste in the mouth after watching it. But yeah, I think this one's gonna earn the drop from me.
Okay. So with that, I without that out, I feel okay now. For me personally, it's starting to get a little more difficult figuring
Okay.
out what show to drop.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think at the end of the day, I'm gonna drop the show that I believe doesn't have the most potential,
Okay.
and that's gonna be Let's Make a Mug 2.
Yeah. Okay.
I think all the other shows, I mean, really the two other shows that I was thinking about eliminating is Godzilla, Singular
Yeah.
Point, and Full
Mm-hmm.
Dive, because I think the other two still
Yeah.
has
Yes.
um,
I know.
pretty good
Like
shows for the both of them.
I think those the other two Higehira and Pretty Boys, like it's like they're both on the green upward trajectory for good
Yes,
reason, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas the other ones are kind of bad.
Yeah.
And although Godzilla and Full Dive had red marks, I think
Yeah.
they still have the potential to go up. Whereas I think Let's Make a Mug 2, because of the format, the fact that it's
Yeah.
only 14 to 16 minutes every time, and the it's set up to be more kid friendly and
Yeah.
comfy. There's not as much character development and not much like the highest of highs that can go. I don't think can match. So unfortunately, Let's Make a Mug 2, I will be eliminating.
Alrighty. Now that we've done the elims, we do technically have save perks. I will
Correct.
not be exercising my save perk this week. Are you going to be
Yeah, and
exercising?
neither. Nope,
Okay.
I am
Yeah.
not exercising my
Okay.
safe perk.
Alrighty. Yeah, I do think that just for my predictions, I'm gonna guess that the save perks will probably kick in when we have to start eliminating shows that we're still willing to watch.
I am willing to
Yeah.
bet in not next week. I think
Okay. But
next week might be easy. I
okay.
think starting the week after there is
Yeah.
potential, but I think
Yeah.
really in 3 weeks we'll use
Yeah,
those
well,
up.
yeah, well, we'll definitely use those up. Yeah, the fact that at this point we have even in our drop list we've still identified a third of them as being like shows that we still want to continue to watch.
Yeah,
Definitely
yeah,
shows the gauntlet's working as intended, right? Like the quality is getting better and better. We're slicing off some of the, the chaff, so to speak.
yeah.
Yeah, this is alrighty. Let's see if this update. Let's see if this update worked. Did it? Well, hold a sec. Did it work? Let's see.
There we go. Yep.
Okay,
I
alrighty.
They're both grayed out. So this is
Yep.
now the state of the show. If you go on to the next slide, it's just a recap of our schedule. We did week 5 tonight. I actually have to update this because we have the house husband, right? As we said earlier,
Yes.
the show is over.
Yeah.
So we're actually gonna. So week 6 is not actually 20 shows; it's 19 shows.
Okay.
So just all those numbers minus one.
Yeah.
Uh, but that got us talking about how we wanted to do the gauntlet because we wanted to give awards to these shows based off how long they kind of survived and like give special
Yeah.
recognition for the shows that actually survived everything. So we kind of talked about this before the podcast, what we wanted to do. So if you go on to the next slide, we have a slight rules recap about what we wanted to do. So from beginning of week 1 up to now, all we've done all we have been doing is eliminating shows that we think are bad.
Yeah.
So at the end of the season, we're going to recognize all the Gauntlet survivors. And so Gauntlet survivors, in order to gain that recognition, you just have to not be eliminated. So in this case, the Way of the House Husband is a survivor. Now, it won't be featured in any of the upcoming weeks because the show's over, but it has the recognition of a survivor. At the end of the season, which is week 12, there'll be about 8 shows remaining at that point, or 8 or 10 shows remaining at that point. They will have survived the Gauntlet as well. And then we will bring back all the shows that have that recognition. So we will be talking about with the House Husband at the end of the season. The only other show that this might happen to also is Yasuke, since it only has 6 episodes, so it'll be ending a little bit earlier. And from all the shows that survived, we both will be picking the top 6 shows, and those are the Gauntlet champions. So just a slight distinction between the two. And just more and more of a difference so that we don't because we didn't want the Way of the House Husband to be known as a Gauntlet champion because I mean right now at least I don't think it's as strong as the top 6 shows.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to sully, I guess, the recognition of
the
being
top
a
6.
champion.
Yeah, and just if you're gonna look at pure placement too, it's always like at the bottom of the middle. It's pretty much. I think it's this. I think it's actually this. I'm trying to think if there's any other show that's as consistently scored as this one. It's also like one of the ones with the least deviations out of it. Like I think it legit just earned 5s across the board for like so many weeks. Like, and it's just like it was like it was what it was, right? It's like here's a specific line of humor and. It took that into real life situations, and it kind of like was that.
Exactly.
And so like to instantly call it a champion also just seems a little bit disingenuous, but it will technically go into consideration. So if we're going to talk about the future, right? Let's say that we have like an amazing show that doesn't last very long, like if it survives a gauntlet, like we'll still bring it into consideration for talks at the very end for it to be a potential champion. I think that the fact that it can still be talked as of a champion means that short but sweet doesn't necessarily just get knocked off the block right away, right? Like obviously right now, just based on the scoring that we've had, very doubtful that it's going to end up being like a top 6, but
Yeah,
It's
we
still
wanted
it's
to
a possibility. Yeah.
we wanted to make the precedent in
Yeah.
case there is a show in the future like that.
Yeah. Hmm.
We're still talking about shows that span multiple seasons.
Yeah.
So, for example, To Your Eternity in '86, I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
will be lasting a little bit longer than the
Yeah.
12 to 13 episodes.
Hmm.
So, we're still discussing that about whether or not they should be included in this Gauntlet Champions consideration, or do we
Yeah.
move that to the next season? But then that's
Hmm.
not fair because they have more character development. So, if you have suggestions or comments on that, you can let us know either on Twitch or on the YouTube videos that we post this on, or join our Twitch community. So this is a good segue. So for the next slide,
Yeah.
if you want to support us, we are on Patreon at www.patreon.com/the anime podcast. You can support us financially there, or if you just want to join the anime community, we are also on Discord. I have linked the channel in the Twitch about description, so you can go ahead and join us there and let us know what you think we should do with these kinds of shows, the multi-season shows.
Yeah. Alrighty. Yeah. So overall, another decent week. Yeah. I think it's the good shows. I think the best theme to describe kind of like how this show went was, or how this week went, was that, like, I think that the rut of storytelling is something that's starting to show up a little bit for, specifically, I think, like the slice of life genre stories. Like, we definitely kind of saw that happening. I guess it is kind of to be expected, but there were also a lot of gold nuggets that were there this weekend. Yeah, I mean, for especially for those top shows, like the top four, like in particular, like just consistently, like they're always there, because, like, man, like, have those shows, like, still, like, for the most part done like a pretty good job. Yeah, it's definitely, if you have a limited schedule and are not sure exactly what to watch, and in descending order, Vivi's Florid song, those Snow White Notes, 86, and Odd Taxi are definitely huge hits that have almost withstood the
Test of time.
the test of time. Yeah, the
At
test
least
of
for the
time.
first
That,
5 weeks,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Like, for the first 5 weeks, like, some of those other shows we've seen, there's a decent amount of like readjusting, mainly because the test of time, like, is really beginning to show for some of these other shows. But yeah, those shows definitely are punching their weights. And yeah, I definitely would recommend. That's gonna be it for this episode. Thanks for listening/watching, and yeah, we will catch you all next week.
Yeah,
All
peace,
right,
peace.
peace, peace.